They called him a stray, until one little girl knelt beside him in the rain and saw the scar that changed everything. The first chill of autumn slipped under the doors of Maplewood Apartments like a quiet guest that no one invited but everyone knew was coming. The morning air carried a faint bite, as if the wind had nibbled at the edges of the night and left the day shivering. Outside the cracked window at the end of the hallway, golden leaves tumbled gently to the ground. They danced in lazy spirals before settling in silent piles that no one bothered to sweep. Millie was already awake. She had made a habit of rising early, not because anyone told her to, but because she liked the hush of the morning before the world got too loud. Her parents were always still asleep, coming off another night shift. Their bedroom door cracked just enough for her to hear the soft hum of the white noise machine. So she tiptoed out, wrapped in her oversized hoodie that still smelled faintly of summer, and padded down the hall of the third floor. Her feet knew exactly where to stop. Apartment 3B. That was where she saw him. Every morning, without fail, a dog waited outside the door, a scruffy, jet-black mutt with patches of gray around his muzzle and a posture that whispered of stories too heavy to tell. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't look around nervously like stray dogs usually did. He just sat there, waiting. His name, Millie decided weeks ago, was Lucky. She didn't know if it was true, but the name felt right. Something about him seemed earned, like he had been through things and come out the other side. He wasn't lucky in the usual sense or not, with that limp in his back leg, or the long pink scar that traced from his left shoulder down toward his ribcage. But still, he was there, every morning, alive and waiting. And there was always a bowl, a white porcelain bowl, chipped at the rim, sitting neatly in front of apartment 3B. Steam rose from it, even on the coldest mornings. Rice, sometimes mixed with shreds of chicken or carrots. Always warm, always ready. Lucky ate slowly, not like he was starving, but like he was remembering something with every bite. Millie would sit on the opposite side of the hallway, hugging her knees, chin resting on them, watching. She tried to be still, invisible even, afraid that if she breathed too loudly, he'd leave. At first, she thought maybe he belonged to the lady who lived inside 3B. Miss Margaret, everyone called her, though Millie had never spoken to her. She was the kind of old woman who wore her gray hair in a low bun and moved like she was saving her strength for something important, rarely seen, always alone. The hallway of the apartment was worn and quiet, filled with the kind of silence only old buildings know how to keep. The wallpaper curled near the baseboards. The light above flickered sometimes, especially on cloudy days. But that little stretch in front of 3B felt warm, sacred almost, like someone had pressed pause on time. Millie didn't tell anyone about the dog. Not her parents, they'd only tell her to stay away. Not the neighbors, they already had too many opinions. She wanted Lucky to be hers, even if only for 10 minutes every morning. A quiet, wordless friendship. One morning she got brave. She scooted a little closer, maybe just a foot, inching across the cold floor like it might crack beneath her. Lucky's ears twitched, but he didn't move. She held her breath and reached into her hoodie pocket. Out came a soft piece of turkey left over from her sandwich yesterday. She placed it gently on the floor and slid it forward. Lucky glanced at it, then at her, then back to the bowl. He didn't touch the turkey. Millie frowned but said nothing. She watched as he licked the last grain of rice from the bowl, then stood. His legs moved slowly, the back one dragging just slightly. With a brief glance, her way more acknowledgement than thanks, disappeared down the stairwell like a ghost sinking into the floor. She sat there for a long time after, holding the forgotten turkey in her hand until it got warm and sad. That afternoon, while walking back from school, she stopped by the stairwell and peeked out toward the alley. Nothing. No Lucky. No sign of where he went. Only the wind sweeping more leaves across the pavement, and the bare branches waving like brittle fingers. She wondered where he slept, if he had anyone. The next morning, she came even earlier. Still, Lucky was already there, waiting. Same position, same stillness. The bowl had been set out again, steam rising in soft spirals. She watched him eat. Again, and that's when she noticed it. When he shifted his weight, The fur on his shoulder moved just enough to reveal the scar. Not fresh, not angry. Healed, but impossible to ignore. A thick, uneven ridge that spoke of fire, or metal, or something worse. Millie's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tingled. That wasn't a stray dog's scar. That was a story. She didn't know what kind yet, but suddenly she needed to. She leaned her back against the hallway wall and whispered to herself, "Who are you, Lucky?" The dog didn't respond. He only licked the bowl clean, stood up with a quiet dignity that didn't match his tired body, and walked away once more. And Millie, for the first time, didn't want to go back to her apartment. She just sat there, under the cracked window, with the falling leaves piling at her feet, wondering about Lucky, about the scar, and about the hand that cooked the rice each morning before anyone else woke up. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Millie was nothing if not persistent. By the fourth morning of watching Lucky eat and disappear down the stairwell, she made a plan. If the dog wouldn't come to her, she'd find a way to reach him slowly, kindly, with the kind of sweetness only an 8-year-old could dream up. Her first offering came wrapped in colorful plastic, a butterscotch candy from the little bowl her teacher kept on her desk. She had taken it the day before, not for herself, but for Lucky. That morning, while he was eating his rice, she scooted across the hallway, inch by inch like a spy on a top-secret mission. She placed the candy beside the bowl and waited. Lucky didn't look at it. He finished his meal with the same slow, deliberate rhythm as always, then stood. For a moment, he paused. Millie held her breath. Maybe he saw the candy. Maybe this was at the start of something real. But Lucky stepped right over it. One paw, then the other. The wrapper crinkled beneath his back foot as he walked away without so much as a glance back. Millie picked up the butterscotch and turned it in her hand. She didn't cry, but something inside her curled a little. The next morning, she tried a slice of cheese. American, square, yellow, the kind that melted on grilled sandwiches and always made her smile. She folded it into a neat triangle and laid it beside the bowl like a napkin. Again, Lucky ignored it. Then came half a hot dog, a chunk of apple, a baby carrot, even a marshmallow left over from last week's cocoa night. Every morning, something new. Every morning, the same silent rejection. She never dared to touch him, never even got closer than a few feet. But every day, she stayed a little longer, talked a little more, even if it was just whispers into the cold hallway air. "You're kind of rude, you know that?" she muttered one morning, after he snubbed a carefully peeled hard-boiled egg. "I'm just trying to be your friend." Lucky gave her a blink, slow and heavy, before turning his back again. At first, her parents didn't notice. They thought she was just up early to watch cartoons or color. But one Saturday morning, her mother spotted her slipping out the front door in socks and a hoodie, holding a slice of turkey wrapped in a napkin. "Millie Rose Carter, where do you think you're going with food?" Millie froze. "Nowhere. Just hallway stuff." Her mom frowned. "Are you feeding that stray dog?" "He's not a stray," Millie answered too quickly. Her father chimed in from the kitchen, pouring coffee. "Millie, sweetheart, you can't go near that dog. You don't know where it's been. What if it's sick?" "He's not sick. He's just old." "Same difference," her mother muttered. "He could have fleas or worse. And didn't you hear about that dog bite in Henderson Park last year?" "That wasn't him." "Millie," her father said gently, "we're not trying to be mean. We just want you to be safe. Booth's not hurting anyone. He just sits there and eats. Someone even gives him rice. Every single day." That's when her mother sighed and crossed her arms. "We're not doing this. No more sneaking out with food. No more sitting on dirty floors. Understood?" Millie didn't answer. She just pressed her lips together and went back to her room, where she drew a cartoon of a dog with a crown and called him Sir Lucky of the 3rd floor. She taped it to her wall. The next day, she still went out. Empty-handed this time, just to see him. She arrived early, hoping to catch him before the bowl arrived. But when she turned the corner, it was already there, filled with something steamy and golden. Lucky was already halfway through. She crouched low, quiet, and stared. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, heavy ones. It was Mr. George from the fourth floor. A tall, thin man with hunched shoulders and a permanent frown etched into his forehead. He carried his morning newspaper like a weapon and always smelled faintly of mothballs. "You again?" he grumbled. "What's your fascination with that mutt?" Millie turned around, startled. "He's not a mutt. He's smart, and someone's taking care of him." Mr. George snorted. "That thing tripped me last year on the stairs, hurt my knee. Could have broken something. He didn't mean to. Don't matter. He shouldn't be here. Should have been picked up months ago." Millie stood up, fists clenched. "Then who's been feeding him? Huh? You think he just cooks rice for himself?" "Mr." George narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He muttered something about calling the building manager and shuffled off, cane tapping angrily on the floor. Millie turned back to Lucky, who had finished his meal and was licking his paws. She sat down again, her back against the cold wall. "People can be really mean sometimes," she whispered. Lucky didn't react. "Don't worry. I'm not giving up on you." That day, she didn't try to feed him anything, didn't scoot closer. She just sat there, arms around her knees, watching him do absolutely nothing. And somehow, that felt like a win. Later, when her parents asked what she'd done that morning, she said, "Nothing." But inside her chest, something was beginning to grow. Not quite friendship, not yet trust, but something that glimmered like hope on a chilly morning. And that was enough. The smell of simmering broth drifted under the hallway door before the sun even broke through the cracked clouds. It was faint but warm, a whisper of something homemade in a building that rarely smelled like anything other than dust and cleaning bleach. Millie had started noticing it a few days ago early. Earthy scents that wrapped around her nose just before Lucky arrived for breakfast. That morning, she was earlier than usual, crouched low beside the stairwell, pretending to tie her shoelace as Lucky climbed slowly up the steps. His movements were always steady, precise. No hurry. No panics. Like he trusted time in a way only old souls could. As he passed her, she didn't move, just watched. He settled into his usual spot in front of apartment 3B. A few seconds later, the door creaked open just enough for a hand-thin and wrinkled to appear. It held the same white porcelain bowl Millie had been staring at for weeks. She could hear the gentle clink of ceramic on tile as it was placed down, and then the door clicked shut again. No words, no eye contact, just ritual. Millie's heart thudded. So it was her. Miss Margaret, the quiet old lady who never left her apartment unless the mail had piled up too high or the weather was nice enough to sit on the stoop for exactly 10 minutes. She never spoke to Millie, just nodded if their paths crossed. But somehow, she had been waking up early every day to cook for a dog no one else even wanted around. The next morning, Millie waited closer, right beside her family's door. No hiding. When the sound of a spoon clinking in a pot echoed through the hallway, she pressed her ear to the wall. "Yes, I put a bit more marrow this time," Margaret's voice said softly, muffled through the door. No, not onions. He doesn't like onions. But carrots, yes. He always finishes it when there's carrots." A pause. "Of course I strain the bones. I'm not going to let him choke." Millie froze. Her chest swelled with something between admiration and disbelief. She could almost see it. Margaret in her slippers, stirring a small pot, mumbling about Lucky like he was family. Later that day, she stood outside 3B, holding a note written in orange marker on pink notebook paper. "Hi, I think you're the one who feeds Lucky. I'd like to help. I can be your assistant." She slipped the note under the door, heart pounding so loud she thought it might echo down the hall. There was no answer that day, or the next. But on the third morning, just as Millie was about to give up, the door opened not wide, but enough to reveal Margaret's silhouette. She held up the pink note in one hand. "You wrote this?" she asked, voice as dry as the hallway air. Millie nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret studied her for a long moment, her eyes soft behind thick glasses. "I don't need help," she said, and closed the door. Millie stood there for a full minute, blinking. Then she sat down on the floor, leaned against the wall, and waited until Lucky arrived. The following morning, Millie tried again. this time with a drawing of Lucky, complete with his scar and crooked ear, taped to a box of saltine crackers. She didn't say anything, just placed it gently in front of 3B and knocked once. The door opened an inch. Margaret looked down, saw the box, picked it up and said, "He doesn't like crackers." Then she added, after a pause, "But the drawing's not bad." The door closed again. That night, Millie baked a lopsided muffin using a boxed mix and left it on a plate with a napkin that read, "You do a kind thing." No response. 2 days later, the door finally opened wide. "If you still want to help," Margaret said, "be here tomorrow at 6:30, sharp." The kitchen inside apartment 3B was nothing like Millie had imagined. It was small, yes, but warm in a way most kitchens weren't anymore. A faded curtain with blue tulips hung over the window. The counter was cluttered, not messy but lived in pots. Jars of dried herbs, a chipped photo frame showing a younger Margaret beside a tall man in uniform. Lucky's bowl sat drying on the rack beside the sink. Margaret handed Millie a tiny apron that had belonged, she said, to her granddaughter. "She's in Nevada now, doesn't cook much." Millie put it on proudly. They didn't talk much at first. Just stirred together, cut vegetables, tasted the broth. Margaret showed her how to slice carrots thin, so they softened just right. She spoke softly, her instructions barely more than whispers, like sharing secrets. "Do you know where he came from?" Margaret asked, testing the broth with a wooden spoon. Millie shook her head. He was a rescue dog. Not the kind that needs rescuing, but the kind that rescues. She turned off the burner and lifted the pot. "His name used to be Bishop. Served with my son's unit, K9 Search and Rescue." No. Millie's eyes widened. "There was a fire, a big one, somewhere in Oregon. Bishop pulled out 2 kids from under a collapsed roof. He got that scar on his shoulder during that mission." Margaret paused, her face unreadable. "My son didn't come back." The words hung there, suspended in the steam rising from the pot. They ladled the soup into the white bowl together. Margaret added a final pinch of dried parsley. Millie carried it carefully, as if holding something sacred. When they opened the door, Lucky was already there. For the first time, as Millie set the bowl down, Lucky stepped forward and brushed his nose against her wrist. It wasn't quite a lick, not quite a nuzzle, but it was something. A beginning. Margaret didn't say anything. She just closed the door softly behind them and returned to the kitchen, where the broth still clung to the air like a memory. Millie followed, the apron still tied around her waist, the scent of carrots and marrow warm on her hands. The first time Millie asked about Lucky's scar, Margaret didn't say a word. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The kind where the world seemed to move slower, like everything was wrapped in a soft wool blanket. The hallway was still, except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock and the gentle hum of a heating vent rattling somewhere behind the drywall. They were in the kitchen again, stirring a fresh pot of broth. Millie had grown comfortable there, comfortable enough to ask questions, not just about cooking, but about Lucky, about life. She'd memorized the way Margaret held the ladle, how she always double-checked the salt, how she whispered small blessings over each bowl before placing it outside. That morning, as they chopped carrots side by side, Millie looked up and said softly, "What happened to his shoulder?" Margaret stopped mid-slice. Her hand hovered over the cutting board, then slowly lowered the knife. She didn't look at Millie, just turned, opened a drawer, and pulled out a tin of chamomile tea bags. She said nothing else for the rest of the morning. Millie didn't ask again. But the next day, taped gently to the inside of her recipe notebook, was a photograph. It was old, faded at the edges. The colors were soft and washed, like a memory viewed through fog. In the photo stood a younger Lucky, sleek and alert, dressed in a black K9 vest with a bold white cross stitched into the side. Beside him was a young man in full firefighter gear, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes crinkled from a broad, boyish smile. They looked like a team, more than that, like family. The photo made Millie's fingers tingle. She didn't know why, exactly, but her heart beat differently when she looked at it. Slower, deeper. She knew, without needing to be told, that this was not just a picture. It was a story. That afternoon, she knocked gently on Margaret's door and waited. When the door opened, she simply held the photo up. "Is this your son?" Margaret nodded once, her eyes unreadable behind her glasses. "His name was Thomas," she said. "Tommy to me." She didn't invite Millie in, just stood in the doorway, framed by the soft light of the kitchen behind her. He joined the fire department right after high school, said he didn't want to sit behind a desk, said people needed him. She paused. Her voice had that soft, brittle edge Millie had only ever heard in old audiobooks about war and winter. He was partnered with Lucky when the dog was just 2. They trained together, worked together, lived like they shared one heartbeat. Millie held the photo closer. She couldn't stop looking at the smile on Thomas's face. It made something ache behind her ribs. Margaret continued. There was a building collapse outside Portland. Children trapped inside. Smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. Her voice trembled. Tommy went in. Lucky went with him. They pulled out 2 little girls before the second floor gave out. She stopped talking then, not because she was finished, but because there were no words left. Millie didn't ask what happened next. She didn't need to. The next day, Millie carried the photo downstairs. She wanted to know more, not just from Margaret, but from anyone who might remember. Sometimes, grown-ups forgot how to tell the full truth. Sometimes, memories were better stitched together from different threads. She started with Mrs. Harper on the second floor, a retired schoolteacher who always smelled like peppermint and wore house slippers with kittens on them. "That dog?" "Mrs." Harper said, squinting at the photo. "I remember hearing about that on the news. Brave little thing. Poor firefighter didn't make it, if I recall. Cancer, wasn't it?" "Yes," Millie said quietly. "Shame. They were heroes." Then she visited Mr. Elkins, who lived just above the laundry room. He barely opened the door but took a long look at the picture. "That was years ago," he muttered, "back when we still had community dinners in the common room. That lady Margaret C. used to bake pies for everybody, until she stopped showing up." Millie tucked that away. Margaret had once been part of something more, something bigger than a hallway and a pot of soup. She asked others, 2 people who barely spoke to her before, but who softened when she showed them the photo. One tenant, a man with a long ponytail and a World War II veteran cap, nodded slowly. "I served with dogs," he said. "You never forget the ones who go into fire with you." And, piece by piece, the story built itself in her mind. Lucky wasn't just a dog with a limp. He had been trained. He had saved lives. He had served beside a man who no longer lived, but was still very much present in every scoop of rice, every slice of carrot, every careful step across the floor. That night, Millie placed the photo on her dresser. She stared at it before bed, whispering, "Tommy," like it was a name she'd always known but only just remembered. In the morning, she went back to 3B, knocked softly, and said through the door, "Thank you for showing me." Margaret didn't reply. But when the door opened a moment later, the apron was waiting on its usual hook, and the carrots were already on the counter. Millie slipped it on and picked up the knife. They cooked in silence that morning. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was full, quiet, but heavy with something important, something that didn't need to be said to be understood. It showed up one Monday morning, taped crookedly to the community bulletin board next to the rusted elevator doors. Notice to all tenants. Effective immediately, the feeding of animals in shared spaces is prohibited. Violators may be subject to fines or further action, as outlined in building policy. Signed, Clarence J. Owens, building manager. The hallway felt colder that day. Millie stared at the paper. The bold type, too loud in the morning silence. She read it once, twice, then again, as if the words might soften the third time around. But they didn't. They remained sharp, final, and unapologetic. Clarence Owens lived on the 5th floor in apartment 5A. Millie knew very little about him, except that he had a stiff walk, a voice like gravel, and eyes that never smiled. He rarely spoke to anyone unless something needed fixing or banning. Kids whispered about how he used to be in the military, or a prison guard, or maybe both. None of them knew for sure. But Margaret knew, and Margaret didn't whisper. He used to be a firefighter, she told Millie later that morning as they peeled potatoes in the quiet warmth of her kitchen. Served alongside my son. Same unit, same days, same fires. Millie paused, potato halfway peeled. Did he know Tommy well? Margaret nodded, though her hands didn't stop moving. They were like brothers, the kind who didn't need to say much. They worked side by side for nearly a decade. And he didn't like Lucky? The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret sighed. Clarence blames the dog. Says Lucky got out of the building, but Tommy didn't. He's never forgiven him for that. Millie's brow furrowed. But Lucky was just following orders, right? That's what dogs do. Yes, Margaret said quietly. But grief doesn't follow rules. That afternoon, Millie walked past apartment 5A. The door was shut tight, but she could hear the low drone of a television inside. She thought about knocking. Thought about asking Clarence why he hated a dog who had only ever waited quietly and eaten politely and saved children from fire. But she didn't. The next morning, Lucky didn't show up. The bowl was full. The rice was warm. The hallway was still. But the space outside 3B remained empty. Millie waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. Still nothing. By the time Margaret opened the door to retrieve the untouched bowl, her hands were trembling. He never misses a meal, she said, more to herself than to Millie. The second day, they went looking. They searched the alley behind the building, the small park across the street, even the narrow space behind the dumpsters where Lucky sometimes napped in warmer weather. No sign. Just wind and scattered leaves and the quiet kind of emptiness that makes your heart sit wrong in your chest. On the third day, the silence turned to ache. Margaret didn't say much. She didn't cook that morning. She sat in her chair beside the window, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes searching the sidewalk 5 stories below. Millie, restless and frustrated, took the elevator to the 5th floor. She stood in front of Clarence's door, fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, only that she had to say something. She knocked. Once. Twice. The door creaked open. Clarence filled the doorway, tall and stone-faced, his flannel shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. He looked at her the way people look at a cold forecastas, something they had to endure. You again. Did you call someone about the dog? Millie asked, voice shaking. His face didn't change. I did. Why? Because rules are rules. This is a building, not a kennel. Animals don't belong in shared spaces. Millie's hands balled tighter. But he wasn't hurting anyone. He just ate and left. Clarence's jaw tightened. That dog should have died in that fire. Millie's breath caught. Clarence stepped back into the apartment, motioning with one hand. You want to understand something, kid? Come in. She hesitated, then followed. His apartment was neat, sparse. Every object looked like it had been placed with intention. Framed photographs lined one shelf. Fire trucks, stations, young men in uniform. In the center, a picture of Thomas and Clarence, side by side in gear, both grinning, soot on their faces. Clarence pointed to it. That was 2 days before the building collapse. Tommy went in with Lucky. He didn't come back out. But that dog did. He looked at her. Not angry, just hollow. And I've had to live every day since wondering if it should have been the other way around. Millie's voice was barely more than a whisper. It wasn't the dog's fault. No, Clarence said. But it wasn't mine either. And yet here I am. For the first time, Millie saw it not anger, not cruelty, but something colder. Guilt, heavy and silent, and buried under years of silence. She didn't argue. She just stood there, the weight of his pain pressing into the room like fog. When she left, the hallway felt heavier than it had in days. She found Margaret still by the window. She sat down beside her, silent. They waited. As night fell, the hallway remained empty. The bowl stayed full. Lucky was gone, at least for now. And in the quiet that followed, something old and unfinished stirred inside the walls of the building. Something that had waited a long time to be seen. The first real snow came the morning after Lucky disappeared. Maplewood's rooftop, wore a thin layer of white, like a blanket pulled over a body that hadn't stirred in hours. Wind funneled through the stairwells, pressing against the windows with soft moans, while the radiators inside clanged to life, rattling like old bones, remembering how to work. Millie sat beside the hallway window, chin resting on her knees, watching the flakes drift down in slow, tilted spirals. The bowl outside apartment 3B remained untouched, cold, forgotten. The porch light above flickered twice before giving up entirely. Margaret hadn't come to the kitchen that morning. At first, Millie thought she might be resting. But when she knocked and got no answer, her heart began to pound. She tried again, harder this time. The door opened slowly. Margaret stood there in her slippers, her cardigan buttoned unevenly, her glasses smudged. She blinked at Millie as if unsure whether the girl was real or part of a dream she hadn't finished having. "Oh," she said after a pause. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you one of the Girl Scouts?" Millie felt something slide loose inside her chest. "It's me, Millie." Margaret's eyes darted left, then right. She gave a polite smile. Of course you are." That day, they didn't cook. Margaret wandered the apartment, looking for a pot she'd already put away. She filled the same kettle twice and forgot to light the stove. At one point, she opened the back closet and stared into it for several minutes, unmoving. When Millie tried to talk about Lucky, Margaret simply blinked and asked, "Who?" Later that evening, Millie sat in her room staring at the ceiling, clutching the photograph of Lucky and Thomas to her chest. Her throat ached. She whispered into the dark, "If I forget him too, who's going to remember?" By the third night, the snow had turned to rain. The gutters gurgled with ice water, and the streets below ran slick and shining with reflected neon. Millie couldn't sleep. Something in her stomach gnawed at her. She sat up, tugged on her coat, and crept past her parents' bedroom door without making a sound. The lobby was empty. She stepped out into the night. The rain hit her face like cold pins. But she didn't care. Her boots splashed through puddles as she made her way to the park, the one just across from the building where Lucky sometimes wandered during the day. She searched the benches, the bushes, behind the restrooms. Nothing. Then she saw it, a black shape, half curled under a narrow gazebo roof, barely visible against the wet concrete. She ran. Lucky was lying on his side, soaked through, his fur matted, breath shallow. One of his eyes blinked open, then shut again. He didn't move. Millie dropped to her knees, heart thudding. "Lucky," she said, voice cracking. "Please." She reached out this time, not carefully, not slowly, and touched his paw. It was cold. A light appeared behind her. Then footsteps. Then a voice. "Move over." "Oh, man." She turned to see Clarence's umbrella in one hand, flashlight in the other, coat drenched at the shoulders. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He knelt beside Lucky and checked his pulse, his breath, his eyes. Then, without a word, he took off his coat and wrapped it around the dog, gently, purposefully, like a ritual he'd once forgotten. "I found him about an hour ago," he muttered. "Wasn't sure if he'd make it. I went back for blankets. You beat me to him." Millie couldn't speak. She just watched as Clarence lifted Lucky into his arms. The dog gave the faintest whimper, then fell still again. They walked back together, through the freezing rain, through streets that glowed with streetlight halos. Clarence never let go of Lucky, not once. Inside the lobby, he handed Millie a towel. "Dry him off," he said, carefully. They moved into the laundry room, where it was warm and quiet, and smelled of lavender and lint. Millie dried Lucky's face, then his paws, then held him against her chest while Clarence built a bed from old coats and a sleeping bag. Once Lucky was settled, Clarence knelt beside him. His voice, when it came, was rough but not hard. "I was wrong about you," he said. "You didn't leave him. You didn't fail. You just lived. And maybe that was the hardest part." Then, softer still, "I'm sorry. You did better than I ever did." End. Millie watched Clarence's hand hover, then rest gently on Lucky's side. The next morning, word spread. Margaret had wandered into the lobby in her slippers, calling for Tommy. She had a dish towel in one hand and a fork in the other. She seemed confused, lost, afraid. When Millie found her, she took her hand and led her to the laundry room. Lucky was still there, breathing easier now, wrapped in blankets. His eyes opened when Margaret entered. For a second, she looked at him and blinked as if trying to place a face from a dream. Then she smiled. "Oh," she whispered, "we meet again, soldier." She knelt down slowly, carefully, and placed a frail hand on Lucky's head. "You came back." No one said anything. Not Millie, not Clarence, not the building staff who had quietly followed and stood watching from the hallway. They all knew something had changed. The air seemed warmer, the storm outside already starting to melt into slush. In that moment, the years slipped away, and 3 lives on girl, 1 woman, 1 man breathed in the same memory, held gently in the rise and fall of a dog's chest. Nothing else was needed. The sky on that morning was the kind of pale blue you only get in the last days of autumn, thin, delicate, as if winter were breathing just beyond the clouds. The storm had passed. The leaves were mostly gone now, swept into gutters or crushed beneath hurried boots. But the air held something softer than cold, something expectant. By 7 o'clock, the building was already stirring. Coffee brewed behind half-open doors. The elevator groaned awake, and taped just beneath the community bulletin board was a single sheet of paper handwritten in large, looping letters. "Thank you for not forgetting me." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who it was from. The note had been placed outside Margaret's door sometime during the night, next to the old porcelain bowl that now sat empty but clean. A folded towel had been left beside it, with Lucky's name stitched clumsily in red thread, probably by Millie. The handwriting on the note matched the one that had once drawn a cartoon dog wearing a crown. Nobody took the note down. In fact, before noon, someone had added a second sheet below it. A neatly typed message from the building office, approved by Clarence himself. "Residents of Maplewood Apartments, in recognition of his service and the compassion he brings to this community, the animal known as Lucky is permitted to reside, under shared care, on the premises of Apartment 3B. It was official now. Lucky had a home. That morning, for the first time in days, Millie knocked on Margaret's door holding a fresh bowl of rice, slow-cooked with carrots and pulled chicken. She had woken up at 5 to help make it. Her mom had even helped her stir the broth, yawning the whole time, but smiling. Margaret opened the door wearing a pale yellow sweater and a brighter face than anyone had seen in weeks. "He's waiting," she said, gesturing to the hallway behind her. Lucky was stretched out on an old rug just inside the apartment threshold. His tail thumped once when he saw Millie. His eyes were still a little tired, his body thinner than before, but he lifted his head with a soft sound that could only mean good morning. Millie placed the bowl in front of him, crouching low. "Extra carrots," she whispered. Lucky sniffed it, then gave her hand a brief, slow lick before digging in. Across the hallway, Clarence leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He had come down early, too, holding something wrapped in brown paper and string. "Figured he could use this," he said, handing it to Margaret. Inside was a folded firehouse blanket, thick, wool, the kind designed to withstand wind, heat, water time. On the corner, stitched in fraying gold thread, were the initials T.O. Margaret ran her fingers over the letters. Her eyes shone, but no tears fell. "It was Tommy's," Clarence said. "Used it in the truck." Margaret didn't speak. She only stepped aside to let him in. Clarence knelt beside Lucky, laying the blanket out before him like an offering. Lucky sniffed it once, then laid his head on it with a soft groan, as if recognizing something long forgotten. That was the moment Margaret gently placed her hand on Clarence's shoulder, and that was the moment he let it stay. By the end of the week, the whole building knew. People began to stop by not to interfere, but to offer things. A small bag of dog biscuits from Mrs. Harper, a heated water dish from the vet tech who lived on the second floor, even an old dog bed someone left quietly beside the mailboxes. No one spoke too loudly about it, but the mood of the building shifted. People nodded more. Doors stayed open longer. Neighbors who had never spoken before now exchanged kind words while waiting for the elevator. Even the flickering hallway light got fixed. The following Sunday, a sign was posted on the same bulletin board where the first notice had once hung. It read, "All are invited to a breakfast in honor of our resident hero, Lucky. Sunday, 9 a.m., community room." No one ignored that sign. Millie's parents, her dad bringing blueberry muffins, her mom making a fruit salad that was mostly marshmallows. Margaret arrived with a fresh pot of bone broth. Clarence brought thermoses of strong black coffee and a tin of shortbread cookies shaped like dog bones. Lucky, now moving with more strength, wore a red scarf someone had knitted. He stayed close to Margaret's feet while people took turns kneeling to greet him, pat his head, and thank him. Some people brought photos of their own dogs. Some just sat quietly, watching. And for a moment, in that crowded little room with its mismatched chairs and sagging wallpaper, there was something beautiful and weightless. A girl, an old woman, a dog who had been left behind but never gave up, a man who had once blamed a friend and had learned to forgive himself, and a building full of people who had, without realizing it, chosen to remember instead of forget. At one point, Millie stood on a chair and tapped her spoon against a mug. "I just wanted to say," she began, "that Lucky didn't need a kennel or a yard or a tag to be home. He just needed us to see him and keep seeing him." Everyone clapped. A few wiped their eyes. Margaret reached over and took Millie's hand. After the party, as people filtered out into the cool November air, Clarence stayed behind to help clean. He folded the chairs, wiped down the tables, and paused in front of the photograph someone had taped to the wall, a copy of the old picture of Thomas and Lucky in uniform. He stared at it a long while. Then, quietly, he said, "Still watching over us, huh?" When the room was empty, Lucky rested his head on the blanket once more. Millie sat beside him, legs crossed, humming a tune she made up on the spot. Margaret brought in a cup of chamomile tea and sat with her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. No one said much, but everything that needed saying had already been lived. And outside, the leaves that remained held tightly to the branches just a little longer.